everyone. I want to share today from the perspective of an American Western person around why there might be confusion for people from the West around what's going on in Palestine and why we might not be caring about it. To be clear, I'm 100% full support of Palestine, free Palestine. People have been struggling for 75 years, struggling to say it lightly. They've been kicked out of their home country. They've been ethnically cleansed. They're second-class citizens all around the world. They cannot return home to their country. A lot of these things are going on, so I'm not here to share any more information about that. All of that is very clear. Palestinians have been talking about what's been happening to them for the last 75 years over and over and over again. But what I want to address as an American woman, as someone who was born and raised in the West and exposed to all the propaganda and programming around this, around why this issue is so confusing and why it's so complicated and why there's so much back and forth around what the truth of this is. All of our programming in the West tells us to be confused, and all of our privilege tells us not to care. And so I want to go through a few points about why that might be happening. So this first point, that it's confusing or it's complicated, it's not. It's very, very clear. This is a genocide. This is ethnic cleansing. This is an apartheid state that has existed by Israel on Palestine for decades, so long, very, very long. You can go to decolonizepalestine.com to read about it. The information's out there. Okay, but so why does this seem so confusing for so many of us in the West? Why is it confusing? Of course, this has to do with media. Okay, who controls the global, international, imperialist media? The West. And because Israel is a settler colonial state and it serves the interests of the West, especially the United States, right? All of the media is going to be upping Israel's image. And now with social media, because there's money there, we know the new currency with media programming is with influencers. So this is why you've seen an increase of celebrities asking to play shows there, drag queens having shows there, this increase of all of these things. And so the Western media is very intentional in shaping the narrative and shaping this programming in how we view and hear and what gets taught about us about this part of the world. The immediate disconnect, the cognitive dissonance, is we're fed this narrative our whole lives about Israel's so good and the Zionist state is this and all these things. And then we see images coming out from the Palestinian people, from the people in Gaza who are so heroic and brave for sharing their story over and over and over again, and whose spirits do not get broken despite the silence from the international community. And so we have the first impact is this disconnect of like, oh, well, we're hearing all this, so that can't be true, right? This thing can't be happening because this is what I know and believe have been told about Israel and their image. But what happens between those two things is the power dynamic there and the historical context is completely erased. And so when you look at this in a 5-day thing, right, people who have never thought about this part of the world before or understood it or engaged in any of the historical context, of course it's easy to say your gut reaction is to side with Israel because that's everything you've been fed your whole life about it. But when you take a step back, look at the historical context, look at systemically where the power is, then it begins to make sense of like, okay, this is confusing because what we're fed and what we're taught and what we're told is in opposition to what's actually happening. And most people in the world have the common decency and respect and care for human compassion in lives to recognize a picture of children who have been bombed, of people who have been ethnically cleansed from their homes, that this is wrong. Most of us know that, but it goes against our programming, and that's why we're confused. And it's confusing because it's not the truth. And so trusting that, but it's like, oh no, wait, well, I was told all these other things, so it can't be true. And then the other part of the propaganda machine is not just the pro-Israel, but the dehumanization of Arabs and people from the Middle East for decades. Okay, a lot of this relies on the narrative that Arabs, all of them are terrorists, they're all barbaric, they're all backwards, they're all, they're not as good as the West, and they just need to be civilized. And just think about, where have you heard that language before? Where have you heard people talk about people of color, and where have you heard those narratives before? And so constantly dehumanizing a whole entire region of people that the U.S. has been at war with, aka colonized and been bombing for decades and decades, and just not even being able to put those countries on a map or know anything about them, that's the programming most of us in the West get if we don't push back or do anything separate than that. So when we have those two things going together, that's why this can seem confusing, because this is what we've been fed for all this time versus what's actually happening and what the truth is. And so the only reason it's seen as confusing and complicated is because it goes against all of that programming and goes against things we've been exposed to forever and ever and ever. And for those of us in the U.S., because of imperialism, because of the way we've taken over the whole world, we don't have to care about what's going on in the rest of the world like the rest of the world does. We get to be immune. We get to be in our little bubble. We don't have to care. Which goes to my second point of, a lot of times, well, this doesn't affect me. I don't want to think about this. My privilege is I don't have to care about it. But if you, again, support basic human rights, that's enough to care about Palestinians and their fight. And one of the most inhumane, it's just so disgusting and so evil. This is enough to care about what's going on because you care about basic human rights. That's enough for me. That's why I care about Palestine. That's why I'm for them. That's why I'm for the Palestinian people, because of what's happening. It's so horrible. It's just beyond disgusting. And so, okay, even if that's not your main reason, right? As a U.S. citizen, the United States sends $3.4 billion a year to Israel in defense forces, in military equipment, and all of this. And so, again, this is how it could never be a conflict. We send no aid to Palestine or to Gaza. Nothing. We send nothing to them, and we send so much here. How is that a conflict? How is that the same thing? Israel is in the United Nations. Palestine is not recognized in the United Nations to speak for themselves, to do all of this. So there's so many power differentials. And again, all that information is out there if you want more details on it. But if we're thinking about people in the West and as Americans, this doesn't affect me. Yes, it does. To be neutral in these situations, our country is not neutral. Our tax dollars are not neutral. What we do in our day-to-day lives is not neutral just because we benefit and we exist within this system that is harming and killing and murdering and genociding Palestinians. Last thing that contributes to this, that is, I think, the hardest one for a lot of people to push back on, is that being anti-Zionist and being anti-Israel is anti-Semitic, and it's not. There's an on-purpose conflation between those two things, between Judaism and Israel, but everyone on the side of truth knows that being anti-Zionist, being anti-Israel is nothing to do with being anti-Jewish. There are so many anti-Zionist Jewish organizations around the world. There's Jewish people who live in Palestine, not in Israel, in Palestine. Jews have lived in the Middle East for so long. Jews are a subcultural ethnic group in Palestine, just like Muslims and Christians are. Okay, this monolithic one culture thing, that's a reductionist view on purpose. So people are afraid to speak against Israel because it's conditioned into us to not be anti-Semitic, which we shouldn't be. There should not be anti-Semitism going on. I support Jewish people, but to the people who conflate Judaism and Israel are the people who want to keep the occupation going. It's not the truth. You can look up, again, so many Jewish organizations and people who are against the occupation, are against Zionism, are against Israel. They're not the same thing. And then this goes back to my point number one about how most of us in the United States are taught, rightfully so, about one of the worst atrocities in human history, which is the Holocaust. And so we have that built-in learned compassion for Jewish people since we were young. In my school, we took a trip to Washington, D.C. We visited the Holocaust Museum. I think that's a pretty common experience for a lot of people in the U.S. And because of that, again, we're taught this programming and this compassion and this empathy, rightfully so, for the Jewish people and the horrible things they have gone through historically. When all that has happened, now we can connect that and we think, okay, if I'm told all the time Israel is the same thing as a Jewish state, of course my compassion is going to go to that side. And if I'm told over and over again, all this programming of the people who are doing it are Arab people, people from the Middle East, then my programming that they're barbaric, that they're savages is going to be like, okay, cool, this is what I think. It's very clear. So it's on purpose. The conditioning is on purpose and they go together. Zionism is not Judaism. Judaism is not Zionism. They're separate. You can be anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and be very pro-Judaism, pro-Jewish people, want them to live in peace, of course. And all the information is out there. There's so many information. Palestinians have been sharing their story forever and ever and ever. Free Palestine. I stand with Palestine. All these things feed into each other. Please push back. Please unlearn. Palestinians deserve freedom. They deserve our support right now and always and forever. Now is the time to push back on this. Now is the time to use your voice. Now is the time to trust when you can recognize human rights being violated, that this is the time to speak up and speak out against these things, because this is what all humans on this earth deserve, especially Palestinians, and especially what they've gone through.